Hello, everyone. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing several articles on the manga artist Kuniko Tsurita and looking at what her unique style says about the usual patterns of behavior seen in the manga industry even today from a somewhat feminist perspective. Now, I say somewhat because I will be discussing this topic in tandem with Mary Gerard's article on Sophonisba and Gisola and the problem for the woman artist, for which she argues. But before all that, I want to give some necessary background context to the nature of the manga industry itself, so we have an idea on what she was breaking into. So when we think about the high art world, we don't really think about comics unless they are tied to big names such as Roy Lichtenstein or Takashi Murakami, people who bridge this gap between the printed format and physical gallery spaces, and who also fulfill that desire for the singular genius artist. But as we've moved into the digital realm in the past couple decades, we put more emphasis on graphic art, starting this conversation about illustrated mediums as another high art of their own. One particular comic form that has until recent years been especially stigmatized in the United States is Japanese anime and manga. And the shows that have been popularized outside of Japan mainly consist of shonen, a genre of manga aimed at young boys. Here we have four of the most widely known shonen manga published since the 80s, only one of which having been written and illustrated by a woman. It should also be noted that Where the Right Through manga all appear in the top 5 highest grossing manga of all time. It wasn't until the manga Demon Slayer that a manga written by a non-male identifying artist made it to even the top 10. This is really recent, so when we think about Kuniko Tsurita trying to imagine a place for herself in the industry back in the 60s, we have to think about the kinds of representation women would have been seeing for themselves in manga at the time. So both shonen and shoujo, the genre conversely aimed at young girls, were dominated by male artists throughout the industry's history. The manga artists from here on out referred to as mangaka, who were women, were encouraged to stick to the characteristically frilly, delicate, soft shoujo styles, which were better served towards emotion and romanticization than the simpler, more graphic styles used for shonen's action-oriented stories. The example I have on the right is, again, a relatively recent series, but it still maintains the delicacy which women were being pigeonholed into as mangaka. This is what shoujo manga looked like in the 50s when Kuniko Tsurita was growing up and aspiring to become a mangaka herself. This was what the then all-male shoujo artists wanted Japanese girls to value and aspire to be. On the left, we have one of the pioneering works of shoujo manga, Princess Knight, written by the same artist who had already gained acclaim for his series Astro Boy, which you might have heard of before. As an established shonen artist, Tezuka was asked to start a manga which younger girls could better relate to. So his solution was to create the character Sapphire, a girl who was born with the blue heart of a boy and the pink heart of a girl, and is able to fight her opponents by pretending to be a male. So it is her masculine side which gives her the strength comparable to shonen heroes such as Astro Boy, not her femininity. Another mangaka involved in the birth of what we now consider the cutesy shoujo style was Macoto Takahashi, who was the first to draw elements from other panels or figures disconnected to the story, overlapping across the page to establish atmosphere and mood. He also established thin bodies and sparkling eyes as the standard for shoujo. From these three images and their composition, we can see that the genre was established by male mangaka as placing more emphasis on emotionality rather than action, on atmosphere rather than linearity. Female mangaka who did enter the industry in the early 60s were limited to this style, such as Miyako Maki, who takes clear influence from Takashi's delicate style to reinforce the proper, gracefully domestic demeanor of young Japanese girls. Now, the subject of my article, which requires all this context, is the release of a career-spanning collection of comics by Kuniko Tsurita entitled The Sky is Blue with a Single Cloud. As the first female contributor to the alternative manga magazine Garo, she rejected the shoujo styles of the 50s and early 60s, which she felt infantilized women and limited their creative range. The shoujo and shonen genres in their early forms were often used to gender young people's values, asserting that courage and power were male traits, and that beauty and domesticity were female traits. However, the first article in which I came across this collection, at times, made it seem as though breaking these norms was the main reason for her uniqueness, mirroring the view of Sophonisba in her time as a social marvel, an exception as a woman artist. The Atlantic article includes a quote from Garo's magazine co-founder in which he proclaims that Tsurita being a woman was reason enough for her to be special, saying that the literary quality of her writing heightened her work above other female mangaka conforming to the traditional shoujo style. That literariness, however, stems from the work that men were making at the time, because the few women influences Tsurita had were highly encouraged to write about feminine emotions and everyday life, rather than high action and intellectual thought. Sophonisba was equally heralded for cerebral aspects of her work, but her male teacher took credit for molding her raw talent into its polished form. In this way, there lies the implication that both Kuniko Tsurita and Sophonisba Anguissola were great because of their emulation of the men in their field, what Mary Garrard refers to as the problem for the woman artist in the Renaissance. To avoid being perceived as only a woman, both women artists placed themselves on a spectrum between being like a man and not woman, with respect to their agency in their identity. Being like a man was the woman's choice, in Garrard's argument, whereas being not woman was a way for men to justify a woman's surprising talent by stripping her of her weaker femininity. We see this in the Princess Knight comic on the left that suggests a young girl's power stems from her accidental masculinity, and again in the Atlantic article, which reads more power in Tsurita's more androgynous characters on the right because of their lack of frilly femininity. The article also wonders about her sexuality and gender identity in relation to the nonconformity she illustrates, but this reads more like those who congratulated Sophonisba for her beauty rather than for artistic prowess. It's all artificial and irrelevant to the work itself. Frustrated, I found another article on the Comic Journal website that delves much deeper into what made Tsurita a unique artist, not a unique female artist. A quote from the beginning of the piece, which I quite enjoy, reads, "As the first and until the mid-80s only woman contributed to Garo magazine, Tsurita's work is unfortunately well positioned to be viewed as an outlier, an anomaly to be pitted disparagingly or superfluously, either against the women who revolutionized commercial shoujo manga or the men who were her peers in the literary underground. Nonetheless, her artistic voice is as singular as her career was unique, not an alternative or a derivative, but an idiosyncratic grammar special unto itself, an elegant scream." Jazan writes about Tsurita's feminine depictions not as a critique of traditional femininity, but as representative of her personal experiences with shoujo manga dictating a set binary for women's gender expression and behavior. Jazan asserts that Tsurita's importance as a female voice in a male-dominated industry was not just for mere inclusion, but for her perspective on the inner world of women in Japanese society with which she informed her deeply psychological manga, especially the stories of victims of abuse and sexual assault. She pokes fun at men's contradicting attraction to both the frilly, cutesy girls of shoujo manga, as well as edgier, mysterious women, concluding that there is no right way to be feminine after all. Jazan writes that Tsurita does not allow her stories about women to be about women. She more so writes on her experiences with disability and neurotypicality, rarely choosing to define the gender of her characters unless necessary to the comic's meaning. As the shoujo genre progressed through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, progressive female mangaka reclaimed traditional femininity and reframed it in positions of power, especially as a result of the women's liberation movement in Japan. One such example is Chikako Urano's sports drama, Attack No. 1, which maintains the dainty, sparkly style Takahashi established, while also giving the female lead strength and power, which is entirely her own and dependent on her femininity. In the 80s and 90s, the magical girl subgenre of shoujo skyrocketed in popularity, with series such as Lalabelle, the Magical Witch Girl, Sailor Moon, and Cardcaptor Sakura. So, while one might be tempted to look down upon the dainty styles of shoujo manga and praise Kuniko Tsurita for breaking from that mold, they must also keep in mind the predetermined expectations set out for women by the early days of the genre, and the power that female mangaka reestablished in femininity by creating cutesy heroines for young Japanese girls to look up to. Tsurita's artistry existed beyond the need for gendered language, making her not an exceptional female mangaka, but an exceptionally intelligent, meditative artist working in her own language, explicitly on her own terms, just like Sophonisba Anguissola. If you want to read more about the history of shoujo manga, Garo magazine, or Tsurita as an individual, I've included my research materials for extra reading. Thank you so much for listening.